All right. It looks like we have quite a few attendees in here. Thank you all for joining us. I see some direct messages coming through Zoom. Keep those coming all day if you ever want to connect with us throughout this next 40 minutes. Really excited about this. It's our very first webinar, Revel Live. And really excited about our panelists for joining us. Thank you to all the attendees for being a part of this, and especially those that were planning to join us a few weeks back, right at the beginning of this COVID situation in New York. I don't think any of us anticipated it being like it is now, but we adapt, and now it's time to go digital. So without further ado, I do want to introduce our panelists here. We're going to be talking about what's actually going on in New York as it relates to the cannabis industry, if it's coming soon, what's happening, is it, realistic for 2020, 2021, what can we do, what's the history of how we've gotten here to date. So first, I want to introduce Ryan Lepore. I'll give you 30 seconds.
Oh, okay. Yeah. So my name is Ryan Lepore. I'm the Deputy Director for New York City NORML, which is a 501c3-4. Just a little background on myself. I used to work for the New York State Assembly, used to also sell TV advertising, and I work at Presto Doctor currently as a business operations manager, as well as sit on the board for Empire State NORML as well.
Awesome. That was concise. I'm impressed.
Nah.
Very impressed.
Don't jinx it, man.
Okay, next I want to introduce Jason Starr. 30 seconds.
Hard act to follow. What's up, everybody? It's Jason Starr. I'm a human rights attorney, educator, organizer, policy advocate, and Revel collaborator for, I guess, like almost 2 years now, going on 2 years now. And I met Jacobi and Lulu in my previous role when I worked in the governor's office on, amongst other things, cannabis policy. So it's really great to be back with you virtually here today.
We are grateful to have you with us. And lastly, I want to introduce Shellise SISTAH Rogers.
Hey everyone, it's Sister Rogers. If you know me and my brand, Sister Rogers, we are a community outreach agency. I do government relations as well as business strategy consulting, and I have an extensive background in finance and accounting. So I bring a business lens as well as a community engagement lens to the cannabis conversation. I'm also a founding board member of the National Cannabis Commission and a board member on NYC NORML. I'm also a coalition member for Start Smart NYC and We Rise to Legalize.
Dope. That's 3 for 3. Everybody with concise answers. If this was an in-person thing, I've never seen that happen. So shout out to you guys. We're starting off good. To the audience, I want to encourage you guys to use the Q&A feature to ask questions. I will be the one asking the questions for the panelists, but in general, we'll mostly let them talk for about 10 minutes each and save most questions to the end. But I'll do my best to try to keep up with all of these. And let's start with Ryan.
Awesome. So hello, everyone. Happy Friday. I'm going to share the screen. I have a short presentation prepared that's just going to kind of outline where we're at today. Okay. Now, hold on a second. Let me share the screen. All right. There we go. All right. Give me one moment. Improvise here. Nothing like a little tech issues while you're in a chat. Hold on a second. All right, we'll just go for this then. All right, so I'm gonna have to walk through it on a PDF for everybody. And all right, so I'll start off. One of the things I mentioned was I used to work for the New York State Assembly. That's kind of how I became accustomed to certain things and movements in cannabis, in New York specifically. I'm just going to go over a brief overview of different things, but right now as it stands, cannabis in New York, what is it? Cannabis is decriminalized, it's medically legal, and it's in the midst of legalizing adult use. So the thing that is to be discussed is, how did we get there? So I'm going to go through a brief history. I would say this is a kind of synopsis from the past 50 years. There's history that goes back and a whole cultural history that also overlays this one. But we can start with the 1973 passage of the Rockefeller drug laws. This changed drug policy in general in New York State. It became extremely illegal to either possess or sell cannabis. I mean, a minimum sentence of 15 years of life in prison, maximum 25 years of life in prison. And then actually fast forward 4 years from then, we actually decriminalized cannabis up to possession of 25 grams, which is just short of an ounce, which would have resulted in a $100 fine. This little possession law was exploited, especially in the 90s with stop and frisk laws. The way that the law is written is that if you bring cannabis in public view, it becomes a misdemeanor opposed to it being a fine for just having it on your person. So this law was a good example of why decriminalization wasn't enough in New York. Now we could fast forward to 2014.
Hey, Ryan,
what's up?
we can only see your opening slide. I think you're on your history slide.
Oh, Jesus. All right, hold on 1 second. You know where it is? I shared the...
If you're using two screens, you're sharing the Canva one.
Yeah, I got you. Here. All right.
There you go.
Can we see this?
Yep.
Awesome. Okay. So let's fast forward a little bit to 2014. This was the year that New York passed a medical marijuana program. It was called the Compassionate Care Act, and it passed with essentially having 18 months to set up. In its finalization, it had 5 registered organizations, as they call it, with 4 dispensary locations apiece. There was no flower, there was limited product selection, and qualifying conditions. Though New York became the 23rd state to launch its medical program, it wasn't really enough, as you can understand. There's no flower, the qualifying conditions are very limited. I mean, to this day, the program is still criticized as being one of the country's most restrictive medical programs. And something important to note was in 2014, the bill actually was calling for 20 ROs with 5 locations apiece, as well as flower, and a very loose set of qualifying conditions. And essentially, when it passed through the legislature, both chambers, it actually got to the governor's desk and changed dramatically, right? Which is what we have today. And actually today we now have 10 registered organizations with just about short of 40 dispensaries across the state of New York. And then I would say the next kind of important timeframes to understand is in 2015, New York became the 19th state to legalize industrial hemp for trials for research. This started to also ramp up in 2017, 2018 to essentially include a lot of the industrial hemp pilot licenses that a lot of companies that we know in New York today to, kind of fuel the perception and change of perception in CBD and hemp products and hemp cannabis in general in New York, and kind of legitimize the viewpoint on cannabis as a plant that could be used as a form of industry outside of what we traditionally knew. And additionally, something else that was important in 2018 was Governor Cuomo announced that he wanted to fund a study on the effects of legalizing cannabis for recreational use. The Department of Health conducted this study, and lo and behold, it essentially concluded that New York should legalize, citing economic, public health, and public safety benefits. After that point, Cuomo then essentially, decided, I'm going to introduce this into the 2019 budget proceedings. Sorry, this was last year. At the same time, outside of New York, New Jersey was considering legalization. Again, the pilot program for hemp changed. There was a lot of movement going on. And then in 2019, which was just very recently, it didn't pass last year, even though there was, essentially a push to do so. And what we did get was further decriminalization. There was light expungement for low-level cannabis, essentially possession. You were allowed to have up to essentially, if you have less than 2 ounces of cannabis, it's considered a violation, not a crime. which is kind of an adaptation of the 1977 update. And, you know, it also defined the definition of smoking in public health law. And additionally, the penalty for possession wasn't $100 anymore, it became $50. I mean, overall, it was progressive that we did this. The only issue was, you know, it's just not enough. You know, we still have had issues. There was recent issues in New York with this being said, with law enforcement still enforcing the law, like cannabis is, you know, the devil's tits. Next thing I would say is 2020. Where are we today? You know, so New York is in the midst of trying to legalize cannabis for the past 2 years in the budget. Also, it's had a standalone bill in 2013. What does all this mean? And, you know, a lot of people are asking, why couldn't New York just get this legalized already? I would say the one positive thing is the government in New York wants this to happen, right? It's just a matter of difference in opinion and the strategy for the roadmap of getting there, okay? So right now, you know, you have the similarities between the two provisions that typically are discussed in New York is, you know, both of these provisions would legalize cannabis. Both of them have an emphasis on social justice. They both would generate tax revenue through the commercialization of cannabis. There would be a centralized cannabis board. There would be also the allowance of micro permits and licenses, consumption lounges. There's really no specified medical improvements. And then also public smoking would turn into a violation opposed to it being a misdemeanor. So one of the thing that if maybe people have been paying attention was the budget provision that just did not pass through the New York State's budget. We call it the CRTA, the Cannabis Taxation and Regulation Act. This was a budget provision, and it had to be a part of our essentially yearly fiscal passage that New York has to sign off on. So a lot of the times, you know, a little bit more progressive items will end up being in this package because it has to be finalized all as one, or else the government doesn't get paid, things shut down, etc. This was introduced last year and also introduced this year. That's the difference in terms of how to get it passed. And, you know, Jason will go into a little bit more of why it's important to try to pass things in the budget. Now, the other aspect of it is we've actually had a standalone bill that exists in both chambers of the Assembly, which is the House counterpart for the state, and the Senate, right? And this bill is the bill that a lot of advocates typically push for. It's a lot more lenient. There's specific tax revenue allocated for, you know, communities in need, and as well as other community regenerative services. And the difference is that this has to pass through 3 chambers of government. That means that the New York State Assembly has to pass it, New York State Senate has to pass it, and then the governor's office actually has to write off on it too. So, you know, the importance of kind of still understanding these two things is that even if it got to the governor's desk, it's very possible that there would be some negotiation back on the points here on the left side, right, the CRTA. Overall, there's a lot of minutia. If people have Q&As about this, they can ask afterwards. But just where it stands now is that the CRTA is currently dead, except for the concepts that the governor's office wants. And then the MRTA, right, C-print essentially, still has till June 1st to pass. But, you know, Jason will go into why this is a little bit more difficult to do. And then, Jacobi, I know I'm getting over my time. This is going to take like a minute or so. In terms of why am I talking about this? What is, you know, NORML? Essentially, you know, what we do as New York City NORML is, you know, we're a 501c3-4. Our goal is to be a voice of the cannabis consumer in New York City. We really feel that local grassroots activation in the city will amount to big change in the greater scheme of the industry. You know, our goals are to engage the community that's already here, activate the community that's here. So, you know, in follow-up from this the webinar, you'll be getting an email with an activation link. And the importance of doing this is that if we get your email and zip code, we can identify the legislators that vote for you. We can then organize and figure out, you know, who you should be contacting, allowing you to take action in a very easy way, whether it's sending an email or giving you the right phone number to call and the script to say. And then, you know, that would essentially amount to policy change, right? If we're able to put political pressure on these legislators. And, you know, the important on our end is that the way that we see New York City is that New York City can really lead the world in advancing the industry, whether it's changing the perception internationally or just the viewpoint worldwide. And we would need to accomplish this with the collective grassroots movement that exists in New York already. Because some of the points that I've listed here is that it's the most culturally diverse city in the world. Also, ironically, the hotbed of COVID. It's also the largest cannabis consuming city out of the world, according to a 2018 study. That's by cannabis being completely, illegal per se. It's also debatably one of the largest metropolitan markets in the world. The current legacy market is estimated to be $4 billion. It's also the arrest capital of cannabis. Essentially, there's been over 800,000 low-level cannabis possession arrests in the last 20 years. So, for us, we really feel that the change here can really, the local grassroots change here could really amount to big change elsewhere. So, thank you all for the time today. And if you have any questions and follow-up questions or want to get involved, follow us at NYC NORML. Shoot us an email, or make sure to check out the email that comes out to this webinar too.
Thank you, Ryan. We will send out a lot of that information afterwards. A question from the audience is, will they get this deck afterwards?
Yeah, I can share the deck. No problem.
All right. We'll make sure to share that. All right. After that, I want to turn it over to Jason and really help us understand what has happened in the last couple months. A kind of deeper dive, what Ryan was kind of alluding to.
Sure. So good afternoon, everyone. Again, I'll just start by saying I've spent about a decade, I guess now, in and around what we call public affairs, but really just like dealing with government. Starting, 10 years ago as an advocate, both in the city and going up to Albany, advocating for, sort of civil rights, social justice policy, and policing and housing and immigration and the like. And then more recently, the last 2.5 years, up to the end of the last session in 2019, as a member of government, as a part of the institution. So I'll just say for me, it's been less about like where I've sat and more about like what I know. And I think, all the movements in the state that have been really successful, especially, really generation defining movements like cannabis legalization has happened because there's been coordination from people sitting in a lot of different places, trying to attack things from a lot of different perspectives. So it's always important to build allies across the institutions. Even if, in my case, when I worked in the Cuomo administration, wasn't necessarily in an institution that I thought shared the same values, not particularly on this issue. But to put some of what Ryan was talking about in context, the legislature in Albany, the state government is kind of working, if you will, every year from January to June. It's a part-time legislature. Arguably what they do off session is deal with constituent issues and are in their districts and so on. But essentially they go to work in Albany for 6 months and they have two real big sort of jobs to do. And they represent kind of two halves of the session. The first one, January to end of March, April 1, is really the budget season. They have to pass a budget, a state budget that funds the government, that funds localities, that funds all the programs by April the 1st. And then often in the second half, they need to take care of other major business. Last year, for example, the rent laws had to be renewed in New York City. So a big part of what happened post the budget was trying to figure out how to renew rent regulation and protections for tenants in New York City and downstate, for example. And so this year started not unlike any other. As Ryan mentioned, I was in the governor's administration last year when the executive introduced the cannabis proposal. Very different than a year before that in 2018, when the governor still was saying he didn't know if cannabis was a gateway drug or not. So a lot happened in 2018. A lot of it had to do with the work that advocates like the Starr Smart Coalition, that SISTAH is going to talk about a little bit, like NORML, and other people, like a lot of you, just educating your family, your friends, your neighbors, participating in events, going up to Albany. And so in January of 2019, you have the Senate, the Assembly, and the executive at least saying like, look, this is something we can do. Of course, it didn't happen. So this year, I think people came back to Albany hopeful. The governor did some things before this session, like hiring someone, a person from Rhode Island, Norm Birnbaum, who had run their program to kind of come in and play cannabis czar, if you will. And also engaged with the governors of New Jersey and Connecticut last December or November, I think it was, and tried to regionalize it. So we were getting a sense that, like, from the executive's perspective, okay, this may be something that we actually really want to get done. He spoke more forcefully about it. So we started January 2020 with similar to the way we started January 2019, but I think with even more hope that, like, the issues that held the bill from passing last year were going to be workable, and that everybody was moving towards that trajectory. And so a lot of what happened in January and February tracked. Usually the governor comes out in the first week, lays out his priorities, the legislature responds with their priorities, and sometime around the end of February, beginning of March, the legislature, the governor, and the executive will start to take those different budget proposals, 1, 2, 3, and kind of bring them and merge them into one. And that's really what March is all about, especially at the end of March. I can tell you, like, last year, I worked in government in state government for 3 years. And each March, I would go up to Albany, pack up, take my entire life up there, and essentially stay for 2-3 weeks, 20-hour days, just like hammering out this budget. And we can have a whole other conversation about how undemocratic that is, especially when you're doing major things like, you know, how we're going to spend $180 billion of our tax money, how we're going to fund hospitals, how we're going to fund schools. But suffice to say that right at the time that would have normally happened this year, boom, coronavirus. And you can't really overstate, like, how what this has done to the politics in New York State. I mean, practically, obviously, we all know the last, couple of weeks, we've gone from not going to work to kind of sheltering in place. The same thing's been true in the urgency that the government has taken to respond to the crisis and create some kind of social safety net by actually passing a budget, is kind of dwarfed some of the other things that you would normally see in the budget. So I think cannabis is definitely one of those things. 2 or 3 days ago, at one of the daily briefings, someone asked the governor about cannabis, and he was like, "I don't think we're going to have time to get it done." And I mentioned kind of before, the two major issues were still what happens to the money, the revenue, and really how much of it goes to disproportionately impacted communities, how much of it really is cashing in of the promissory note on the war on drugs. And more importantly, though, like, who gets to control that and make that determination year to year to year to year to year. And the executive always wants more control over the money, and the legislature never wants to give up control of the money. And so that's a real big tension that I don't know would have been solved even if we weren't in coronavirus kind of situation. So I mentioned there are 2 parts to the session, right? The budget part. The budget just passed. This is my own commentary. It's really, really terrible for poor people, for Black and brown people, for the people who are going to be impacted most by this virus in New York. Really, really slashes programs. It gives the governor power to go back periodically to cut more based on lower revenues, particularly from the federal government, and lower tax revenues, as we could expect. But setting that aside, it's unlikely the legislature is going to come back. The way that they operated over the last 5 or 6 days, the kinds of things that they passed, the age of the legislature, the nature of having to vote on things in person. I think all of that suggests that they're not planning on coming back before the end of June. And then the last point I'll make, just in terms of the politics around it, I don't want to be cynical, but they're also disincentivized to come back, especially to take votes on what they consider to be hard issues, like cannabis legalization, at least for some of the folks, because everybody's up for re-election in November. And so they need to be home in a lot of ways to really deal with like constituent concerns. I mean, the situation on the ground, in terms of what people are going to need is going to just get more acute, right? But it's also to their advantage to stay home, to stay visible, to do as much as they can because they're running for re-election, right? So a lot of sort of folks who follow the politics of this say, it's not really looking good for coming back, especially to do what they consider to be hard stuff like cannabis. So I think it may be a 2021 situation. That may not necessarily be a bad thing, but I think the question just becomes, what do we do in the interim to hold folks accountable, and also to make some changes that I think we could make without legislation in order to at least prime the pump, if you will, and that includes like dealing with the hemp situation and all of those outstanding license applications, and certainly expansion of the medical program through regulatory action. So I think I'll stop there, and I'm definitely looking forward to questions and the like. So thank you.
Thank you, Jason. Perfect transition to Shellise, kind of talking about if it's unlikely to go through in the next couple months, what the future holds for the next 12 months when they come back for 2021. I just want to make a comment. I see many questions in the Q&A. Shellise, you have about 7 minutes instead of 10 now.
Okay.
And then I'll directly ask some of those questions.
Okay. I do want to make a few comments that may answer the questions ahead of time because I was also scrolling through them. So the MRTA print that was just released includes updates like having a chief equity officer, some tax rate adjustments, clarifications around the roles of the Cannabis Control Board and the executive director of the Office of Cannabis Management, which is a gentleman named Norman that Jason just mentioned. And then home cultivation, it will be allowed for 6 plants and allowing 4 new medical dispensaries from the new entities. 2 of them have to be within underserved communities. I knew some people were asking about home grow, but once again, this is an MRTA, which is kind of socially known as the Advocates Bill. Jason just asked what happens to the money and how it goes to communities impacted by prohibition. As of the beginning of this session, New York State has had a $6 billion deficit, and with the onset of COVID-19 and its economic repercussions, we're expecting.
Shellise, we lost you.
Shoot her a text.
Good. Okay. Which we're expecting this deficit to be exacerbated even further because of COVID-19. And so that means that marijuana legalization may be an important 2021 session item for its tax revenue mainly, and that tax revenue will most likely be funneled into the general fund. Quick background on what the state general fund is one of 6 major operating funds that are used for like the executive, legislative, and judicial departments of the state government. And it covers things like childcare, criminal justice, economic development, public health and safety, Medicaid, all these other things that we need socially for per state. What I want to focus on are the things that all of us can do within these next coming months. Since we are all kind of forecasting that this may be a 2021 legislative session item, then the things that you can do are continuing to get educated by attending these types of live webinars or conferences or information sessions and events. It's important to ask questions and find resources to help with this process, especially if you are a person that is looking at the different types of business opportunities and getting into this industry. In order to have the industry that you want for your business, you also will need to do some sense of not necessarily lobbying, because not everyone's a lobbyist, but some form of civic engagement in some way that will then create the type of industry that will allow your business to thrive. You want to continue to build relationships with people and know who those people that you can contact for more information. Once again, taking the time, and thank you so much for taking the time today to even come on to this live webinar and engage with us, getting all of our information, keeping in contact with us, signing up to newsletters. When we're disseminating information and we're keeping on top of what's happening, of what we're seeing, we can then pass that information on to you. That's how you keep your network popping, and that's how we can work together to find best solutions. Third is to register to vote and register your friends and family to vote. In the midst of COVID-19, all of that may be kind of difficult for people to do. However, it will kind of teach us different ways to go about civic engagement when virtually or utilizing technology. So when fewer people show up to the polls, then that means that each vote counts more. And once again, your local elections really matter in this area, because if your local assembly members aren't for cannabis legalization, or you don't know their status on cannabis legalization, as Ryan brought up, when it has to go through all these different chambers, if your legislator for your specific district is already saying no, then you can possibly be counted out of the cannabis conversation. They may have the ability to opt out as a county or an area from cannabis, from cannabis stores and dispensaries being opened in their areas. Fourth is taking action, which is lobbying, getting involved in your local chamber of commerce, attending city council meetings, and these are all ways to just hold your legislators accountable. I can go into more details about that if you have questions. I'll also be providing my email address and ways to contact me afterwards if you need more nitty-gritty about how to go about civically engaging in a way that will produce better benefits for you and your business down the long run, especially with cannabis possibly being on a 2021 item. And then I'm going to talk a bit about the business opportunities coming in. So for everyone who is currently on this webinar who does want to take part in the cannabis industry in hopes that in 2021 cannabis legalization will come to New York, you need to understand what your industry sector will be. Will you be plant touching, or will you be in an ancillary service? Doing some slight advocacy. Once again, the laws that govern New York's adult use market will affect the sector that you choose and your barriers to entry. Doing your market research. Who are your target customers? Where are they? What demographic can you, demographic data can you research? And is there a social need for your product or service? Then also networking. Once again, keep your network popping, connecting with people like us who are all here on this webinar, reaching out to us, coming to events, coming to webinars. When we do have some ability to actually see one another, again, attending Revel events, attending all the types of events that you can. Finding funding, depending on your sector, you will need funds for real estate, licensing, marketing, lawyers, and all these unforeseen costs. Like if cannabis legalization was going to be passed in the budget this year and you already have been sitting on real estate, so then that way you could apply for your license. That means that you're paying for the mortgage or rent, property taxes, and all of that, all this while until COVID-19 is over, and then the licensing process can be restarted. And then the last part is having patience and persistence through all of this. Get your business plan together, set some realistic timelines. COVID-19 is really going to push a lot of things back. There are going to be a lot of issues that will take front and center stage in 2021. And like I said, marijuana legalization may be looked to as an out, and looked to for its tax revenue implications. We have a $6 billion deficit that's only growing amidst this COVID pandemic. So they may look at cannabis legalization as, oh, well, that can help fill in this deficit because we can't count on the taxpayers who currently don't have fluid income anymore to pay more taxes. And I hope that helps.
Awesome. You squeezed it in a tight timeline. Thank you for being dynamic, Shellise. I know everybody's on mute, but if you can give our panelists a round of applause, and maybe your housemate will hear you clapping or snapping. I'm going to go through some of these questions, and we're going to see how many we can try to answer in the next few minutes. Thank you guys, everybody who's adding them here. The first one is how the conversation is going with using jobs creation from the cannabis industry, especially as a lot of hospitality and retail folks are in a tough position right now. So each of these questions I'm going to ask, if just one of you can try to answer, and we'll try to get through all of them.
I mean, I have no problem answering this if someone else wants to take it. But, essentially one of the things to look at is, I mean, just the facts are now that cannabis has solidified itself as an essential, right? People are still spending money on cannabis. People are already out there and doing this. And if anything, it was already needed beforehand because it was already something that was here. But now, if anything, more than ever, it's solidified its importance in society. So in terms of the discussion behind it being able to create jobs and still have merit in the midst of a pandemic, I mean, all of these things reinforces its importance in society. And also right now, the government's losing tax revenue off of not taxing cannabis, and people are spending money on it out of all the things that are necessities to them. So I think that's important to know going forward, because the discussion is going to become more intensified of job creation, creating tax revenue, and all these things. It's going to help fuel, what this can actually do for everybody going forward.
Thank you, Ryan. Another question is I have, when the multi-state conversation happened, was there any mention of Northeast state interstate commerce in THC cannabis? To said another way, were the other states looking at kind of creating their own market altogether?
Shellise, do you want to answer that one?
You can take that. I feel like our answers may be similar in this manner. They're all trying to keep that tax revenue to themselves.
Yeah, that basically is it. I think the interstate coordination was kind of like, okay, the federal government is not acting, and if we're going to do something that taxes and regulates, we're going to have some level of parity as much as we can across these three states, especially because there's so much interstate travel happening amongst those three states. It's so easy to get from Jersey through New York to Connecticut and back. So the idea is like, we don't want to have inconsistent regulation and taxation. We're going to compete against each other in the way states do, but we don't want to create a situation where people are highly incentivized to just go to New Jersey or New Jerseyans to come to New York, or vice versa with Connecticut, so that you can maximize intrastate revenue, I think is probably the game on that.
Makes sense. Thank you. Have there been any conversations about small home grows?
I'll thankfully take this if possible. Yes, there has been. So, essentially the two different pieces of legislation, there are actually stark differences in this conversation. The CRTA, which is the governor's proposal, would allow for medical home grow. So patients that have a medical card would be able to grow up to 4 plants. There's some other things in there that someone would be able to go onto your residence, and people would be able to go and check these plants, and all this kind of stuff would eventually get worked out. But in the governor's proposal, it only would allow for medical home grow, opposed to, general 21 and up. The MRTA, which is the thing that's currently in play, if you want to call it, right, in the two legislatures, does allow for 21 and up growing, right, up to 6 plants, as Shellise mentioned earlier. And, this would essentially allow for someone to grow for personal use. And, again, in the conversation of COVID, this is important. If people are quarantining in their houses and most of the cannabis is coming in from elsewhere, this actually allows people to be able to supply themselves if it is an essential in their own home, technically speaking. So it actually adds to the conversation as well.
Cool. And kind of a similar question to that. What do we know about how they're thinking about craft licenses? How big or small is that? And any understanding of the amount that they be looking for of licenses? I know it's all up in the air, but just the conversations that have happened to date.
I mean, Jason, if you want to elaborate, but I mean, just on a really where it's at is that a lot of this stuff gets designated through the OCM, which is both bills would establish a central regulatory authority, and they would be determining the amount of licenses. Both of these bills include craft licenses or micro businesses, if you want to call it. It's just one of them actually allows, the governor's proposal allows for the already medical program ROs to transition their business into adult use as vertical integrated operations, right? Whereas the MRTA is completely a multi-tiered licensing system. It's a lot more focused on craft licenses. Either way, the amount, the number, the specifics, a lot of these things get hashed out through this office. And Jason, if you want to add to this, let me know.
Thank you for not adding to it, Jason. That means you did a great job, Ryan. Another question is, any understanding of what taxation might look like? Whether it would, I mean, like, I think somebody heard $1 a gram. Do you know where they're leaning towards currently?
Taxing was like one of the most complicated. I mean, tax is complicated generally, but the idea was to tax by dry weight, and then to have like tax at each tier. So you'd have like a producer tax, and then a wholesaling tax, and then you would get away with essential like retail taxing at the point of sale, but that it would be incorporated into the cost of the product. And then you'd have some cost control. Remember, it's a regulated market, so you'd have some cost control to protect the margins of everyone in each tier, particularly the retailers, the folks who are assuming the most risk, if you will, in the supply chain. But then all the numbers, right? Like talking about like that's the construct. The numbers, I don't think, obviously not having there weren't really a lot of three-way negotiations on the bill this year, so the numbers are obviously important, but I think people were coalescing around that concept of like having tax at multi-level tax, avoiding retail tax at the point of sale, and then just figuring out like what do the numbers need to do to make sure you keep the margins so that the businesses will survive over time. That was the theory. I can't comment on the specific numbers.
There's a lot of time to see how that actually comes.
Yeah.
This was a 45-minute webinar. We have a lot of really good questions. I would propose that we stay another 5 minutes if our panelists are able to do so. We can try to get some more of these. Do I get thumbs up from all three of you?
Yeah, happy hour over here doesn't start until 2, so. Okay.
Perfect. Let's see here. Is the state taking applications for medical dispensaries?
Currently, no.
Yeah, just to quickly elaborate, this is something that was a point of contention. Originally, there was 5 ROs, then it turned into 10 ROs. And then when there was the extra 5 that were added, the first 5 actually sued the state. So the state's a little bit reluctant to go and add licenses. But something important to note in the essence of like what you can do next to try to expand this is that there are standalone medical bills in New York. There's actually about 40 standalone cannabis related pieces of legislation in New York right now that are separate from the things we focused on today. A lot of these things would improve either criminalization related laws or the medical program itself. There is a couple pieces that would expand the current program as it is. But overall, a lot of these things tend to be in the construct of kind of keeping the same type of dynamic with, ROs opposed and, separate locations or franchisees in the sense of, that. But that's where that stands medically.
And ROs represent registered organizations, meaning the medical dispensaries that already are operating in New York State.
Thank you. I have a quick question that I will answer. Our groups are online communities that bring together all the people in the New York in this space in New York? Is there maybe a Slack channel? That's a great question. The Revel group has been all in person until today. So we are exploring a couple different ways to engage our community, and we'll have a quick survey in our follow-up email that I would love for you to respond with your preference. All right, let's see if I can get through a couple others here. Is it technically possible to pass a bill between September and December, leaving aside the question of the election campaign?
No, that would have to be under like really special circumstances, but everything happens during the legislative session, which really starts in January and then ends in June.
There is the governor does have the power to call back the legislature, what they call a special session, and the legislature actually can go back on their own by what's called like majority consent. And it's been used before, but usually it's like emergency, certain sort of like emergency situations where, say for example, a piece of legislation says either you need to like pass another bill to deal with this, or all the power goes to one or the other, or revert back, something that of that magnitude. Not usually policy issues. And as I mentioned, because the governor got the power that he wanted to reduce the budget over several periods of time based on, it's called pandemic review actually. It's just unlikely that they would utilize any special power to call the legislature back, because they could really then start passing a lot of all kinds of shit he doesn't want, and so not likely that will happen.
All right, I'm gonna keep the questions going until you guys tell me we need to tap out. All right, let's see here. With the legacy market, I hardly think any dealers will be signing up. It seems like in the last few years, there have been multiple people and corporations that have created a trail to go legacy. As people think of the legacy market and part of the law actually for people like me or my dealer is for people taking advantage of it. Why should I not start selling cannabis today and create a record to get a legacy license?
So I this is a big this is a concept that doesn't always get talked about. Part of this is that you have, I think the thing to always remember, especially with New York, the things I was mentioning earlier, we already have a cannabis market, right? It's already estimated to be $4 billion. So that means that everything's already transacting and people are already running per se businesses. So a concept that's come up to NORML at times is, how do you actually encourage these businesses to play in a legal market? And, to the question that was asked is, essentially the incentives for any of these people actually, what's it called? The juice worth the squeeze per se. And then the other end of that too is, to the point of, why, if legacy licenses or something that are, if people are getting priority, if they're selling cannabis, then why not just go and sell today? So you have a better chance of, if you go break the law today, then you have a better chance of getting a license. To my understanding, I know that from what I understand, Jason, you can chime in here. I know that the governor's office is trying to look at having auditors be involved in the process. This whole part of, cannabis legalization in New York is a very lengthy topic. We could talk about this for a very long time. But overall, it's something that is a little bit intricated because of the fact that cannabis is illegal federally versus the state, and the state doesn't want to essentially, open itself up to a complete lawsuit to encourage interstate travel and, et cetera, et cetera. So it's, the thing that has to happen is that we need to educate ourselves and look at this differently and, essentially normalize the outlook on cannabis and, try to really find ways to engage with, the legacy market, if you want to call it. But, to that point, it's definitely it's intricated, it's complicated. So.
That's a very good question. All right, given the situation with COVID and the results in cannabis not being fully legalized, Do you think that between now and 2021, there's more time to refine things further regarding legislation?
Absolutely, through once again being civically engaged and reaching out to your current local legislators, as well as pinpointing if that local legislator is going to be up for election. Many city council seats are about to be given up next year in 2021. Recognizing and pinpointing where these people stand and reaching out to them now doesn't hurt the process for next year.
I have to admit, I've moderated a lot of panels, but this is great because people just give me the questions. I don't have to think about them. All right. So I had a couple comments on taxes that we discussed, but what can we do to get ideas to MRTA? I'm not fully sure what that means, but maybe where can we find what is in the MRTA?
Or I think more like how are people, if someone is a grower or, existing operator, how can they get their ideas into the legislation or into any of these bills? And then there's a follow-up question that's kind of riffing on the same idea is, how are the proposals for these bills coming into play? Are there organizations or experts that the state is talking to help craft these bills?
Yeah, so just to elaborate on that, I think part of what's really, with the MRTA that's introduced, the thing that, you as a consumer or a voice is that if you have ideas, you gotta share them. You gotta participate. You gotta let people know what it is. No idea is essentially stupid. We live in a country where your opinion matters. So with MRTA, you do have two sponsors, right, on the Senate side and the Assembly side. Those are direct places where you can submit ideas to. So those legislators know how you're feeling about things. The other thing that you can do is ask for, let's say that your legislator is a co-sponsor of the bill, right? You can ask them to essentially ask those people to introduce something specific because their constituents brought it up. Now, in terms of the groups that are behind these things, right, the MRTA is something that's been really heavily supported by the Start Smart Coalition, right? And the Start Smart Coalition is a mixture of various advocacy groups that have been really leading the charge on this for a couple of years now in New York, and still are. New York City NORML is a part of this coalition. So I would suggest if you want to go that route, right, which we do have access to these same people that we mentioned, you can submit those questions to us. You could submit those questions directly to the coalition. I think after this, when this all follows up, we can have some access points for you to engage with as well. Hope that answers the question.
Yeah, and a follow-up to that, I think ties nicely is, are there any newsletters or outlets we can be a part of to get some of this information regularly? That's just like a layup for you, Ryan?
Yeah, I mean, like I said, if you activate with us, we're in the midst of developing this newsletter, but this would essentially go over a lot of different things. And like I said, there's 40 different bills out there and a lot of people know about these things. So, maybe if we can't get this whole big bill passed at once, which is the easier thing to do, essentially the thing that solved the bigger issue, we can maybe try to lightly improve what we have now, right? Because that actually might be more palpable for legislators in Albany.
And I would just add one thing. Sometimes my experience over the last couple of years has been, the cannabis community can be somewhat closed. And what I mean by that is there's a lot of different issues when you talk about cannabis legalization or advocacy. You have the business side of things. You got the criminal justice and racial justice component. It's a really multi sort of textured community with a lot of different stakeholders and a lot of different needs. But I think it's also important too to make sure that you're doing all of this in context when you're politicizing something, to make sure you understand also just like what's happening politically, especially because our government, particularly state government, is designed to be so opaque. Like it's designed to be not transparent. And so there's all these other things that are going on sometimes that we lose sight of when we don't contextualize like our core issue across a bunch of them. And just as we're moving through the next couple of months, where I think, like the fact that the needs that people are gonna have are gonna be so manifest. Like we're gonna have to figure out ways to tie our interest in movements and work to what we know is happening and what our government is responding to. So like if you do add to your daily diet something like a city and state, they do a daily sort of digest, doesn't flood your email, but it does give you a sense of like, and City and State was a magazine. I think it's pretty much all digital now, but essentially City and State politics. Not a ton of stuff to read, and you don't have to dig down to every article, but at least it'll give you a sense too, like what the hell are people talking to or not talking about, who's making certain moves, what events are happening, etc. It's just a good way to stay, keep everything in context without, diving too far into politics if that's not your interest.
Agreed with Jason. City and State is awesome.
All right. We are out of time, but I do want to thank everybody once again. Thank you for all of our attendees at our very first Rebel Live. I hope you guys enjoyed it and this was helpful. Thank you to our panelists. You guys, I've known each of you for a while, and like what's in your brain still surprises me how you retain all of this. You guys are a wealth of information. And then just for everybody to keep in mind, this is our first of a series we'll be doing weekly, touching on all different types of topics that we think are important to our community. We'll be sending a follow-up email Monday, as well as posting this video if you wanted to go back and look. And in there, we'll have calls to action so you can be active, resources, information on our panelists, and a survey for you to help us understand what we could do better and how we can grow from this. So on that note, I want to thank all of you guys one more time and have a great weekend and stay safe.
Happy Friday, y'all.
Bye, everyone. Happy hour.
Yeah.